Okay, principles of light. That's what this video is about. Lecture. If you are new to this channel, I'm Robert Revels. I'm a professional artist. I am a professor. I am a coach. I teach digital painting as well as 3D skills and everything in the sort of sphere of stuff. I've been helping people do this for a while, but what this video is about right now is all about light. Just the basic principles. This is not a demonstration on paint. It's just teaching the understanding of how light interacts with objects, and it's really important because it's going to help you understand when you go to paint what it is you're trying to replicate based off of nature of light. There's so much to this. I have so much content based around this, as well as a lot of tools, and I built all kinds of little shortcuts for my classes. I'm not sure how much of that I'm going to put out there on YouTube. We'll find out, but also we'll see how you guys respond to this. But in the meantime, let's just get into it. Enough talking. Okay, so we're starting to move into some important things that we need to know about light. So we're talking about principles of light. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so what is light? Light is a type of energy called electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation travels through space in tiny bundles called photons. This is very similar to what you will have with sound waves. You can see over here on the diagram I have ultraviolet rays, the visible spectrum of light, color, gamma rays. We don't need to know all of those details, but we do need to think of the photon, okay? With what is light, right? So a photon is pure energy and has no mass. When at rest, a box of photons the size of an elephant weighs nothing. So basically what that means is we don't feel light, right? Or it doesn't have weight, let's say that. We could obviously feel what it feels like on our eyes, right? We can feel the heat of sun, but in terms of the light rays, it's not something that's quantifiable in terms of mass. Okay, so here's the thing. When you have a photon, okay, what happens is it will bounce out and it'll reflect. It will either pass through, form, matter. It will be refracted and bend through mass. So that could be water, that could be a glass, right? So what the main point that I want you to see here is every time you have a photon, and there are photons all over the place, they're basically rays of light. These are the beams. These lights will expand down, and again, it's going to reflect off of a surface, it's going to pass through a surface, or it's going to bend when it hits the surface. Now, there are a couple other little tiny things we'll talk about later, but I'm going to talk about just some of the main principles right now. So you have three basic principles of light. And like I said, if we were to get totally scientific and go deep into this, there's more. But for what we really need to know as the core principles, these are it, right? We have reflection, absorption, refraction. The reflection, as we just said before, it'll bounce off of an object. And also, let's talk about absorption. We haven't talked about that necessarily yet. The color of an object is determined by the wavelengths of a light that the object absorbs and transmits and then reflects out. That's a very scientific term, but it basically means when you see a color, it's based off of the absorption and what's reflected out. And also, I'll talk about that later on because it does make a difference in terms of what we see as bounce light, okay? Now, refraction, we just talked about that. It's when the light waves or the photons are being bent as it goes through matter. Okay, so reflection is when light bounces off an object. We just said that. And when it bounces off an object and reflects back to a viewer's eye or a camera's eye. Okay, that's important. This is one of the most recognizable light principles because it's everywhere. It's everything that we see. So we have two types of reflections, and this is where it gets important, okay? We have specular reflection. This is known also as regular reflection. This is when you have something that's very smooth, like glass, a lake. It's basically a mirror reflection. Okay, so when you have something really smooth, when a light ray hits and bounces off of there, you're going to get a mirror reflection, something that's unbroken. Diffuse reflection. This is when you have something porous, something that is obviously not smooth. Waves, wood, rock structures, anything that's irregular is going to have the light scattering off of that and is going to bounce back in an irregular way. Okay. So let's go ahead and start looking at specular reflections. I'm going to call it specular. You will sometimes see in different books and different things where people will refer to it as a regular reflection, but I'm going to refer to it as specular. So if we look here, when the light comes in, okay, it's an incident ray. Okay, when it bounces out, okay, it's a reflected ray. So you have the incident ray comes in and then it bounces out. Key point to understand, right, when you have that mirror reflection is this, is that you have the angle of incident is going to be the angle of reflection. What that essentially means is, let's say whatever the degree is, right? So if you have a 30-degree angle in which it touches out, it's going to be a 30-degree angle as it comes out, okay? And overall, that would be 60 degrees in total, right? It could be 45, it could be 90 going in. If it's 90 going in, it's 90 going out. So if you draw a dotted line through the middle of that, that's going to be the angle of, again, the reflection coming out. This is important to think about. Okay, so here, what I'm going to do is show you some examples of why this is important. And I'd put it in a controlled environment so that you'll be able to understand it. So it's inside of a kitchen. The room is actually not this dark, it's just the way the photo is shooting it. But you can see you have light coming from window and you have a light coming from over top. Here's a close-up of the light that's over top. You can see it's a warm light. And if you actually look on the light, the lamp shade on the right side up top, you can see the light coming in from the window bouncing on there. Now you can see we have a specular reflection, but also what I want you to think about as this light comes in, it's also the ambient light. Okay, ambient light means it's the light that is already present in a scene before an additional light is added. It usually refers to natural light, right? We're talking about the sky dome, which is outside, okay, and it comes through windows. And it can also mean artificial light such as normal room lights. So an ambient light in that situation, which we'll talk about this stuff later on, it's not something that's a main light source. It's just something that's meant to create a mood, right? A nice, warm, soft light. But it's not really the light that's illuminating the room. It's just setting a tone. In photography and cinematography, available light or ambient light refers to any source of light that is not explicitly supplied by the photographer for the purpose of so essentially it's the same thing. It's the light that's in the room. It's not the main light. Okay, so let's go ahead and look and see how this affects things. Okay, so if you look at this bottle, right, and I'm not advocating going drinking beer, but it's a perfect image to show you. If you look at this beer bottle, okay, if you look at all those areas, what we normally think of as highlights are actually specular reflections. And this is important because a lot of times when we're in school, we're just like, oh, just draw a highlight. You just draw a highlight. But if you think about it and really understand this, you're not actually drawing a highlight. You're drawing a reflection. And on certain surfaces, it will reflect like a mirror, like this bottle, and then we'll see on other surfaces it'll diffuse and it'll look like nothing but just diffused light. So if you look, you can see the lampshade and you can see the recessed lights in the ceiling on one of the arrows that are top or middle left. You can see it on the very top. It's the same thing. It's just diffused out a little bit more. Okay, you can see it coming down in the bottom, but it's diffusing out a little bit, and you can actually see the window literally on the bottle. And you can also see on the edges of this bottle, which I'll talk about later on next week, Fresnel effect. You can still see the reflections on the outer edges of the bottle. It's being compressed, but you can still see the reflection. It's the same objects that we're talking about. So here I'm just showing you same environment, just showing you the recessed lights in the room. Okay, so now let's look at this. Okay, if you look, we have the light recessed lights, and this is a glass table that this coffee cup is sitting on, and you can see the light is reflecting off of that glass and putting those circular lights. Okay, if you look on the cup, right, you can see all the areas where I put with the blue, you can see it's coming from the window. And then all the areas where I put the yellow, you can actually see the recessed light, right? So you can see it gives a different light quality. But you can also see, and we're going to talk about colored lights later in temperature, but you're seeing it here. And having that complexity of warm and cool light in this environment, even if it's nothing like this, it makes it more visually interesting. If we just had all yellow on the whole thing, it would not have any appeal whatsoever. And you can see this is just naturally giving us warm and cool. Okay, so you look at this, it's just a bowl, right? My kids ate cereal, and now it's just sitting there empty. And I looked at it and said, I got to take a picture of this. This is perfect, because you could see the lampshade literally on the handle, right? You could see it. You could see the circular shape, and it's being elongated and stretched down the handle of that spoon, right? And you're seeing the lampshade on the edges, the little bevels. You're seeing it in the milk, right? And then you see the blue reflected light, or ambient light, I should say. Let's keep it clear. The ambient light that's coming from the window is hitting all flat sides and corners. So let me explain that. If you look at the handle of the spoon, you see it's on a beveled corner. That's why it's just a sliver of light. Okay? Now, if you look over on the side of this bowl and you see the long flat side here on the left where it's all blue, that panel where I have the blue arrow pointing to it, that is the same thing as that sliver on the spoon. The difference is the surface area is much wider. Right? If that were a compressed little bevel, it would be a sliver like the other side. And I'm saying this because it will give you logic when you're trying to light your scenes and add color, right? You're like, oh, this is that one side, the light's catching here. It's a long, fat side. So again, it's a reflected light. It looks like a highlight when it's a thin area, and when it's a large area, it's diffused. And so when you get to the top side of that, you see I have a yellow arrow on that left side, and that's where we're getting lampshade, and it's being stretched on that little bevel, and that's why it feels like an elongated lampshade highlight. Okay? And you're seeing, every time you see a little reflection all over this bowl, those highlights, we normally call them, they're just reflections. Okay, so I'm pulling this back up again so you can see it in another situation. Okay, now this light here is underneath the, it's on a counter underneath the shelving underneath. Okay, the cabinets, and I want you to see what happens when I expose the image to different lights. Okay, so watch this. So I took a cup of green tea, matcha green tea, and I put it up underneath there. I'm a matcha green tea freak. I make this all the time, like probably drink it way too much. But I put it up underneath that sink, right? And if you, I mean, not the sink, excuse me, the cabinet. And if you look on those bubbles, what do you see? Long lines. They're the fluorescent lights that are sitting up underneath. That's why the shapes are lines. Okay? You just see it everywhere. Now let's look. Same day, same everything. All I did is took the cup and I moved it into the island in my kitchen. And now what do you see in here? Okay? If you look closely, you do see on some of those bubbles, you're still seeing that line. And you're seeing on certain areas, it becomes more diffused because it's being pulled away. But then also, what do you start to see? If you look closely, you see the window coming in, right? And then if you look really closely, some of those lights from above are starting to come down. So you're now getting 3 little different colors bouncing in these bubbles. So that's what will make something interesting. And so when you're designing things, you want to think about what's going to be more compelling? Do I just want one shape on this bubble? Do I want multiple shapes? Okay. So now, if you look at this, same thing, right? We're looking at these specular reflections. If you look at them, right, you see a few of the long bands on the far edges of those tomatoes. You still see some of the circular shapes of the window, and you also see some of the lights coming from above hitting directly down, right? You can truly see the circular shapes of those pendant lights hitting down. You can see the pattern of them, right? You know, it's like 6, and then slightly move it, you see 6 again, and again you see the long lengthwise of some of those on the far edges of that light that's underneath the cabinets. Now look, I moved it up underneath the cabinet, right? And now you're seeing long reflections, right? And if you look, I marked a couple of these so that you can see that you have the blue coming from the window, very subtle, you barely see it. But then if you look at a couple of these, look at the greens, right? And it's very hard to see it, but if you look at the green arrows, those tomatoes, their orientation are turned vertical. And because they're vertical versus horizontal, you'll notice that the reflection, that long reflection, looks different, right? It looks fatter and a little wider. Because when you have specular reflections, they will look different depending on the form they're on. And when you rotate the form, the specular reflection will change. So here, if you look, you have elongated because it's up underneath. And if you look subtly, you see those dots because now the pendant lights, and that actually might be the pendant lights because you can see 3 pendant lights that are directly behind. And then if you look, you see the blue window reflecting in on this cap. Okay, so here, coffee mate, right? Look at you can see the pendant lights literally on the cap. And you see those yellow lines, those are the lights bouncing back, reflecting from behind me underneath the cabinet. Okay, so all of those things are behind me. Okay, so now we're moving outside of the kitchen, and I'm just going to put random things in here so you can see what's happening. So here we have a very shiny, reflective bug, right? He feels slimy and wet, and I'm assuming it's a he, it could be a she. But what you see is the sky, right? That's the sky on reflecting off of the body. So again, it's the brightest light, but it's a reflection. I want to keep reiterating that because what happens is this, and people put generic marks down for highlights. And because they're very generic, they're non-descriptive, they don't add visual interest, and they don't say anything. And that's why we're discussing this at length here. Okay, here, I'm just holding these chrome balls, and what literally I have is a ring light that I had set up for some of these shots. And you can see the specular, the brightest reflection on there is the ring light. Everything else is reflecting in there as well. But the ring light, again, is what we would perceive as the specular light. And then also, you could see that because it's a chrome ball, you're seeing the light bounce, and you're seeing the chrome balls bounce off of each other at the same angle of incidence. Okay? So you can look literally at the center of that ball and you can see it. here we have, okay, my father-in-law and my daughter. So if you look, I want you to pay close attention to his helmet. Also, look at the mirrors. If you look at the helmet and the mirrors, you can see my wife's hand in there. You can see the environment on the other side because that's what's reflecting there, right? You're seeing this reflection everywhere. And honestly, we haven't talked about diffusion yet, but you're seeing it on her shirt, her hair. It's everywhere, right? Here, the lower half. If you look at the light in the front, you can literally see the sun beaming down, hitting it, right? And you see the blue sky. And you see everything else there as well. If you look in the glass on the front of that, right, you can see some of my wife reflected in there. You can see pink, right? If you look at the handlebars, you see pink, right? You see my wife. And so whenever you have chrome, long, skinny elements, the reflections get flipped sideways and run long, right? So you're seeing it everywhere. If you look at my father-in-law's hand, right, it's really shiny. Right, so it's actually his hand, for whatever reason, maybe his hands were wet at that moment. That's why it's reflecting so sharp, right? So that's another thing to think about. Wet, people sweating, that creates reflection as well. Look at this car, right? Reflections everywhere. The chrome, the paint, all of it. Okay, it's unavoidable, and this is what you're looking at every time you look at something outside and in your room. Okay, you see the reflection of her on the bus. Okay, here we see it in her eyes. Right, it's flipped, mirror flipped, but we see it in the eyes. Right? The moisture on the bottom of the eyes, we see the signage in the eyes, and we see the hanging lights in the eyes. They're not a generic circle. Now, there are times you will see a generic circle, but that's usually if you're in an artificial light room, and that's when you'll see that, okay? Here, we have a male eyes, just so you can see the difference. Here, you can literally see the window reflecting right back at you. So again, it's not generic. And another important part is each eye's reflecting something slightly different. Because when you have a reflection, it does matter the angle that you're viewing it. So if you even move slightly to the left or right, the reflections will look slightly different. And that little bit of nuance is what makes the piece more visually interesting. Okay? Okay, so now what we have is, I was actually in a, what is it? It was a Barnes & Noble's, right, in Reno, Nevada. You don't have very many bookstores anymore, but this was a very big window. You could see the reflections of the lights inside bouncing off that window, okay? Inside the same environment, okay, I'm in the same environment. You could see the lights. You can see the reflections from the lights that are above, those circles. What are those? Recessed lights, right? We can see them there. You see the blue bouncing in from that window, ambient light. You see the blue on the top of that cup. Same environment, right? Now, look at that table, okay? And this is a specular reflection, but it's actually becoming diffused. So I could have put this in the diffuse section, but I put it here. If you look at the table, it's not a perfect reflection. It's not chrome. You can see it's diffusing out. And so it's really, I would honestly could call it more diffuse. But now if you look at the pastry glass, that is a specular reflection. You can see the contrast between the two. Now, I'm going to show you a pumpkin later when we talk about diffuse reflections. But I want you to see on this image, if you look at the reflections, right, it's coming from that same window at a different time of day. It looks very shiny, very specular. And I'll show you another version of the pumpkin where it looks very matte and diffused. Okay, but when you have that specularity, things feel glossy, shiny, like you want to touch them, right? You know, they call it like the shiny chasing shiny things syndrome, where anything that's shiny looks brand new and we want to go after things that are shiny. This is actually an important psychological thing to think about when you're doing your artwork, because if you add some shiny specularity, it will make the eye gravitate towards it. And it's a way to hook people into your work. Here, more reflections. Here, eggs in a bowl. You could see how the lights are bouncing, reflecting into the bottom left of the egg whites. If you look on the egg yolks, you can see the recessed lights. And if you see the long light there, it's the light that's coming from underneath the cabinet, right? And it's amazing how those lights are able to find themselves inside of this bowl. And if you look at the specular light reflections on the bowl, if you see those little lines, right, those little scratched in lines, it's not a smooth surface. So what's happening is the light on that surface is being diffused. So you're getting both things happening here. You're getting mirror reflections as well as a little bit of diffused reflections. Okay, I love this because, again, it's a mixture of two things. You can see the lights literally as mirror reflections in on the yolk, pendant lights, right? And you can see the long light, which is coming from underneath the cabinet. But then you also look at the shell. The shell is a perfect example of diffused, right? You don't see reflections really on there unless something hits it and it's a little wet, but it becomes really matte and diffused. Okay, so here is just an example of showing a living room where you have lights coming. And so with the chair, what you can see here is the light and how it's being affected, right? You can see the light from the window and how it is affecting that chair. Okay, so it's reflecting. It's diffused because it's not a mirror reflection, but what you're seeing, again, you're not seeing highlights, you're seeing reflections of the environment, of the light source. So that, again, I want you guys to think about that over and over and over again. Here's a good example where if you look at the light, right? In San Francisco, it was raining. So now when you see the puddles of water, they become basically mirrors. And you could literally look at each little puddle and it becomes almost like a perfect mirror reflection. You could see the upside down reflection of whatever's in the environment. Everything else, those little tiny glimmers of speckles, those little dots that are dancing, those are, imagine, you could think of it as like tiny little mirrors, right? Tiny little water puddles, even though they're microscopic, but because they're wet, that's why you get that kind of iridescent sparkle that's hitting everywhere. And that's how you would create the illusion of wetness, is by putting that sharp specularity. Obviously, it's not going to be a perfect reflection, but if you look at the figures and you look underneath their feet and just look where you have those lights, you could see the light, and you can see blue, you can see orange, right? Because you look up above that sign, you see orange in front of them. You see blue lights on the tree, you see blue lights on the floor. They're diffused out, but it's still a reflection. Okay? And you see it everywhere. Here I thought, I was cleaning up my kids' toys and I saw the ball sitting there. I was like, that's a perfect example. The lights above in the hallway were hitting right down on it. And again, it's something we would consider specular or a highlight, but it's just, again, specular reflection. And again, this is our last slide, and it's again showing you have a puddle of water, becomes a mirror reflection. Okay? And and if you look at something like this, if someone painted this would be really visually interesting because you don't see the reflection connect on both bars. You could see the diffusion in between where you could see how the line wants to connect, but then there's this lost and found, and then it picks right back up in the actual water puddle. And again, something like this is going to be, this is how you make images that are compelling. And one last thing to think about is that when you have reflections, remember, they always have to lose intensity once they hit an object, even if it's a perfect mirror or chrome ball. Okay? No matter what you see in a photograph, remember, it always has to lose intensity once it bounces it and hits an object. We just scratched the surface. Light, this subject in terms of painting, but not just painting, for photography, but let's stick to digital painting. It's deep. Light is really important because the color of light affects the objects, the materials, and the way light is affecting that. It's super important. So if you're interested in this, I have a course on it, and I'll be releasing it within the next week or so, because I did a few updates to it, want to perfect it, make it even stronger. But if you're interested in that, go to my link down below to the website so you can see where it's at, what's involved with it. But there's a lot involved where we're going to go with this, and there's a lot of demonstrations, paint demonstrations, and also how to use this in the particular field you're in. Because lighting used, how I would use it doing concept art, I would paint in a different technique than I would maybe for illustration. One, I need to be able to have flexibility, and one, I don't need as much flexibility. So my methodology is completely different. Okay, so keep that in mind, but that's one of the things that's the beautiful aspect of the course. I go through all of that and explain it so you understand, and you have groundwork on how to do that. All right, so if you're interested, hit the link below. Otherwise, just stay tuned. Throughout the year, you're going to see me hit on some of these points here and there. So hopefully I'll see you.